So happy to be here with you here today.
Thank you.
The book is amazing.
Thank you.
And I have my well-worn copy of The Empathy Edge here and my trusty green highlighter. And it's an incredible book we're going to talk about today, and I think a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss in the book, the thing I like about the book is that you lay it out so clearly and concisely that it's an easy but really sophisticated read, and you allow us to make it really actionable both in our personal lives and in our business lives, which I think is really critical. It came out on October 22nd, so I had to speed read it and to get here to this point and to take some notes. But I think one of the things that I like to do when I read a book is I like to read all aspects of the book before I actually read the book. Front cover, back cover, all of the things that people have said about the book, all of the credits in the book. So I think the best place to maybe start is reading the back cover of the book. And what can you learn from Empathy Edge? In this practical playbook for organizations of all types, Maria Ross pairs her knowledge as a branding expert with proven research and fascinating stories from executives, change makers, and community leaders to prove that empathy is great for business and may transform you on a personal level. When I read that, I was like, I'm in, let's go. And in the book, you say you're going to recruit us all to the empathetic army, which everybody in this room, it's easy for us to say are high achievers, and We're going to recruit them into the empathetic army so we have positive energy in the universe. But before we dive into that, the book's organized into 4 parts, which we're going to try to follow for this. The first one is why more businesses need to cultivate empathy now, the empathetic leader, empathetic culture, and the empathetic brand, and they all build on each other as we go through the book. But I think the best place to start is, how do you define empathy? Like it's a word that we hear a lot about. You can't turn on the TV or listen to a podcast without hearing the word empathy. So how do you, in your research, where do you feel empathy fits, and what's your definition?
Well, that was an interesting challenge because everyone I interviewed for the book had a different definition of what empathy meant. And you can look at dictionary definitions, you can look at even the definition over time.
Right.
You know, empathy meant something very different in the 1500s than it did in the 1800s than it does today.
Right.
But I kind of boiled down for the purposes of the book and this discussion that empathy is really about taking another person's perspective, understanding their point of view, and using that information to inform an action. Because the action part for me is what was key. There was a lot, there are a lot of books out there about the theory of empathy, but for me, I was trying to do something like you said, which was great to hear that you said I accomplished that, which was really give people, okay, so what do I do to strengthen my empathy muscle or cultivate my empathy? Because actually this whole, like, I'm not a naturally empathetic person is BS, because we innately, science says, we innately are hardwired for empathy as human beings.
Right.
It's just like working out, though. So some people have been to the gym every day for whatever their environment or their upbringing or whatever, and they're more in touch with their empathetic side. Other people haven't been to the gym in a while.
Right.
And so the actions in the book are designed to be specific things, specific habits, traits, practices that might feel artificial when you adopt them at first, but again, it's just like working out. Like it's kind of a slog when you first start and you go to the gym. But eventually, you know, your prefrontal cortex changes, it rewires, and then these things start to become part of your natural operating procedure, and it starts to become easier for you to adopt that lens. So I'm trying to get people in by, you know, speaking to their selfish side that it's good for business, and then, like I said, transform them from the outside in.
Did your point of view on what empathy was, because you did a lot of you mentioned science and some biology just there, which kind of went over my head a little bit.
Not my favorite thing,
okay.
yeah.
Did your point of view on empathy or your definition of empathy change from when you first sat down and wrote your first word to going through all of your research and getting to actually the physical book in your hand? Did it change? Did it evolve?
It slightly, in that I always kind of went at this as empathy is adopting someone else's point of view. I really, for me, Barack Obama's definition of seeing through the eyes of another was very compelling for me. A few things that did surprise me was the whole thing about learning that it is innate, that we are hardwired, unless you're a sociopath. And, but also that it can be used for evil, because some of the best con artists in the world use empathy to get what they want. So it's a talent and a skill that we can apply for good or evil. And
We're
in this
gonna
case, we're talking about good.
Good, yeah, of course. And we're going to come back to the empathy veneer, which you talk about
Right.
in the book. Because I think empathy and compassion and sympathy often get confused, right? So as we're talking about, like, yeah, I'm an empathetic person, or I have compassion. What is the difference? So as we're thinking about going in our day-to-day lives and how we manage our teams and our business and our clients, like, what's the difference between those three?
Yeah, I struggled with that one, to be
Okay.
honest, and my editor was calling me out on it a lot. But really, the definitions that I found that kind of, it's one of those things where you can find the data to support whatever you believe on what these things mean. But really, sympathy is much more about, there's an element of pity to it. There's an element of, like, I feel sorry for you. But it doesn't mean I'm seeing things from your point of view. It doesn't mean I'm really imagining what things must be like for you and adapting my actions. Compassion, I did find, and some of my interviewees confirmed for me, this idea of compassion is an act you can take. So you can't really do empathy, right? But you can do a compassionate act. So how I laid it out in the book was more that adopting an empathetic mindset can lead to compassionate action. Now, people can take compassionate actions without empathy. They can give money to the poor, they can volunteer in their community without ever really understanding what life is like for those people. But the magic happens when you adopt that empathetic mindset, and when you take that compassionate action, it actually gets it out of your head and into the world.
Interesting. And you talked a second ago about developing the empathy muscle. And when before we did our pre-call, we talked a little bit about, as you go through life and you experience sometimes a personal crisis or even a professional crisis, it gives you the opportunity to maybe see things through other people's eyes that you may not have seen it that way prior. And I think we've both been through those.
Right.
In the first 20 pages of the book, you talk about a traumatic time in your life that actually showed you and maybe even inspired you to write the book. Maybe talk about that a little.
Yeah, so I survived a ruptured brain aneurysm in 2008. And the Cliff Notes version is that I was in the hospital for 6 weeks. And that was actually what opened my eyes to an organization operating with empathy. And what does that look like? Because our experience in that hospital was amazing. And it was by design. It wasn't just because there were a bunch of nice people running around. Like, there were policies and practices and training put into place for that hospital. It's called patient and family-centered care. And so this is what we mean by operationalizing empathy. The key to it is not just, let's all be nicer to each other, because what does that really mean? But that experience, number one, it made me very empathetic to people being without health insurance, which I had never even thought about because I had never been sick at all. And number two, just the patient experience. I do a lot of speaking to hospitals now to try to get them to be, doctors to be empathetic about, this is what your patient's actually going through. But also as an organization, like, what does that look like to actually adopt empathy initially because you think you're going to get business gains from it, which is how this whole movement started. Hospitals wanted to save money. They wanted to reduce patient readmissions, which cost them money. They wanted to reduce malpractice suits. So it was a somewhat selfish reason. But the end result is that people feel heard, seen, respected, cared for in that environment. And that can apply to any business, whether you're in healthcare or whether you're in customer service or what have you. So that was kind of an eye-opener for me.
It's interesting. And did it inspire you to write the book, or what was I'm always, there's a lot of people around me writing books right now, so I'm always fascinated about what inspired you to actually start with the outline and write this particular book.
It was a direct result, I have to be honest, of the 2016 election and the behaviors and the incivility on both sides that I saw going on. And my son was 2.5 at the time, and I started to really be scared about the world we were creating. And I was having this conversation with clients and colleagues who were feeling the same way. They were like, what do we do? We feel all this stuff. What do we do? I'm just a web designer, or I just run a software company, or we don't all have to go join the Peace Corps to make a difference. And so I started exploring this idea of, instead of us all, again, just saying be nicer to each other, how could we put that into action every day? And what better place to start than the place where we spend the bulk of our time, which is at work. So if we can't master empathy in the place where we are 8, 9, 10 hours a day, do we
Right.
just expect we're going to be empathetic when we, close our laptop and walk
Right.
out the door?
Right.
And we've all seen those behaviors in toxic work environments where you're like, who is that person? But that person has a family.
Right.
They're someone's daughter. They're someone's son. I'm sure they act kindly and with compassion when they're outside of the office. So why can't we run our businesses that way? Why can't that be part of the equation, not just as colleagues, but also with our customers as well?
Yeah, I think the narrative that I often have in my head is everybody's dealing with something.
Exactly.
I didn't write that, but it's certainly something that, again, when you deal with things in your life, you realize that everybody that you're dealing with probably has something going on in their life that indicates or influences how they
Yeah.
are acting or performing or whatever.
Totally, and it's getting to the bottom of what's coloring that, what's the context, right?
Right.
Whether it's an angry customer or a difficult colleague. And again, this is not, should just tangent, we should be clear, empathy is not just giving somebody what they want, because that's what makes business people scared to do
We were going to get
right?
there, but I'm glad you went there.
Right,
Yeah.
so it's this idea of understanding the context of where someone's coming from, why they have that opinion, why they're taking that stance, why are they being short and rude with me? Oh, it turns out they're taking care of an aging parent and had a really bad morning and couldn't get out the door. Or it turns out this project is bringing up some stuff for them from a project that failed miserably that they did at a past company, and they're trying to avoid that happening again.
Right.
So it's understanding that those decisions and those actions don't happen in a vacuum. And we just need to slow down a little bit, because it's actually going to save us much more time and efficiency and make us more successful if we, number one, factor that mindset into the decisions we make, even if it's a decision people don't want.
Right.
Because some of my most empathetic bosses are ones that told us things we didn't want, including a boss that laid off the entire marketing team. And he did it with such compassion and empathy, and is a wildly successful, wildly competitive leader. This is not some, wallflower that gets trampled over because he's empathetic.
Right.
He has bought and sold companies. He has been successful, but he does it with such empathy that he engenders all this loyalty. I feel like that almost contributes to his success.
Interesting.
So, that's really the mindset we're going for here. It's a philosophy and a mindset to help you make decisions, even if they're decisions that might be unpopular.
Well, let's go off-road a little bit, off script maybe. I told you we would do that, and we're not even in the first couple minutes to do it. So again, we have a room full of high performers. I would imagine all highly competitive people from the advertising world and beyond.
Oh, yeah.
So when we're competing or high pressure, deadlines, there's a lot that happens in our business where it's becoming more and more competitive by the day. You started to touch on it. In a world like that, where maybe historically empathy and compassion would be seen as, Danny said, maybe softer skills, how does a leader and a team member maintain a sense of empathy, the body language of empathy, and also stay highly competitive and from a winning perspective as well?
Yeah, and to that first point, I just want to point out that that's another real impetus for this book, was I gathered the data and the research and the case studies, and we could spend 2 hours talking about all the statistics about how empathetic organizations have increased customer loyalty, sometimes better share price. They're more innovative. They retain top talent better. Some of their employees would be willing to work longer hours, and sometimes for less pay, not that we want to go that way, but for an empathetic employer. There's a lot of data out there that shows that environment and that treatment of your customers actually impacts the bottom line, which is what I was trying to do with the book, about convincing skeptics that this is anything but a soft skill. It's actually going to be what keeps you alive.
It comes
as a
through.
company,
It comes through in the book.
And as a leader,
you
exactly,
weave it through.
So some of the individual things, again, might not feel natural at first, but I offer kind of a host of habits and traits in the book. I think the first one is really to practice presence, and that sounds all woo-woo and mindfulness and blah, blah, blah. But if you are too stuck in your own ego and your own agenda and your own anxiety, you have no room to take another person's perspective. You have to quiet your own mind, and you have to focus on your own self-confidence before you can then reach out. It's that whole, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before helping others. And
Took me a while to figure out what that was.
And that makes sense,
actually,
yeah,
when I did that, but
exactly, right? So I mean, that's really where you have to start. And that's why some of the most successful leaders are those that meditate, those that have some sort of mindfulness practice, even if they start their day with 10 minutes of deep breathing, or how they approach going into a contentious meeting. Are they going in with, this is what I want to do, this is my agenda, this is what, or are they going in with more of the second trait, which is to be curious.
Right.
So the highest trait of highly empathic people is that they are curious. So instead of, again, I go into a meeting with you or a client of, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to say. When I hear that opposing view, instead of coming back with, here's why you're right, or why I'm right and you're wrong, get curious. Why do you have that position? What is your goal? Why do you think that that's the better way to go about that? What do you see as, how do you see that leading to success? Asking all those investigative questions, number one, it diffuses the tension, because then a person feels heard. But number two, then you can get to something where it's like, okay, aha, we both agree on that.
Right.
So let's start from that kernel and go from there. I heard an interview on NPR last week with a woman who wrote a book who used to be a CIA operative. And ironically, that's actually one of the CIA techniques they teach, is you have to establish common ground.
Interesting.
That's the only way you can get through like hostage negotiation or whatever, is where is that thing where, what's that topic, what's that goal, what's that intent where we both agree, and let's build up from there. And curiosity helps you get to that. So asking those questions, this sounds trite, but being an active listener. So when you ask the questions, listen to the answer.
Yeah, right.
Not just keep talking until I can say what I want to say.
Right. Or think about what you're going to say next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's being able to take it in, and then, because you have presence, responding accordingly. And I should note, I'm horrible at this. Like I'm a redhead and I'm Italian and I'm like the most impatient person. So
that makes two of us.
Sometimes
not a redhead, but
Italian, yeah. So sometimes you write about what you need, right?
Yeah.
But that's why it's like the gym analogy is a perfect thing. You have to constantly be working out. You have to constantly be thinking about it. Sure. And eventually it becomes second nature. But it's going to feel really artificial at first to do some of these things.
Well, I was cut off on my way to work this morning, and I was really curious as to where that guy was going, and maybe he's running late, to a meeting.
Or where were you going, right?
But I used that body language.
Right, but it calms you down like, physiologically too, right?
You have to practice it.
Exactly,
You got to get in the gym. You got to practice it. Okay, so that's the first section of the book that you have is why more businesses should cultivate empathy. And you outline really two big reasons to embrace empathetic tactics in your business life. The first one is you talk about cognitive empathy, meaning you understand how other people see the world, especially as you go across cultures.
Yes.
Because a lot of people here, I would imagine, aren't just U.S. based, that we deal with.
Right.
In my case, French culture or British culture, or even Asia Pac in some ways, which changes it completely.
Totally.
Which is a whole other, probably your second book.
No.
Cross-cultural empathy.
Well, no, and this is great.
Yeah.
Empathy is the glue that makes diversity work. I mean, this entire conference is about representation and diversity. But if we just stop at representation, we're just a bunch of different people sitting around a table disagreeing with each other, right? We're just, so how do you start to harness the power of that diversity? How do you get all of the financial benefits that, HR leaders, CEO leaders cite from having a diverse leadership? It's through empathy. It's your experience is totally different from mine. So I talk about in the book, it's not the golden rule. It's not do unto others as I would have done unto me. It's do unto others as they would have done unto them.
So you call that the platinum rule?
I don't call it that. I'm not going to take credit for that.
Okay.
But yes, it's called the platinum rule. And it's about getting to know a person and their circumstances and the context enough so that you know what's informing their opinion. And then you can say, oh, this is what that person needs in the moment. Not what I might need, but here's what's going to motivate them. Here's what's going to get them to buy in. Here's what's going to get them to collaborate with me. So focusing there.
Do you have, in the book you talk about, there's some questions that you can ask. There's some, because sometimes in a, whether it's a negotiation or whether it's a critical conversation that you're having with somebody, the emotions can get the best of you, right? So if are there questions that you can ask to your point about either finding that common ground or trying to understand where somebody's coming from or what their experience is?
I think one of the best questions that I even learned from doing this book was a leadership expert that I interviewed talked about not even asking somebody what their goal is, but actually the word choice is, what's your intent? And it tends to get more to really what it is they're trying to accomplish. Goal is sort of a loaded question, but if you ask somebody like, what's your intent with this negotiation or your decision, and what's your desired outcome? Like using those kinds of words and using language in a way that diffuses the conversation and invites somebody to open up and be vulnerable. And then, you can respond in kind as well, as like, well, my intent for this project is X. And then you can start to find that common ground. I think that's a really good one because we often go like sort of, what is it you want?
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of judgment and defensive-ness in that.
Right. Or I disagree.
I already disagree with you, right?
Yeah.
So, but like sort of, okay, you have that point of view, Paul, like what's your intent with that? Where do you see that going?
Right.
How do you see that succeeding? And then you can have a productive conversation from there.
Well, vulnerability is interesting.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a big part of two parties or multiple people trying to have what I would consider to be an empathetic discussion. Is you do have to have some level of vulnerability, as you said.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it takes time to get there.
Yeah, and I know there's some workplace constraints we deal with now about like how personal you can get with people, but some of the successful leaders I interviewed for the book, one of them especially talked about how he's a CEO and founder of a global nonprofit. And they start their Monday leadership call with just going around the room and doing sort of a grounding of, where are you? Like, oh, I had a fantastic weekend. I unplugged. I did all this. Oh, I'm knee deep in crap, literally, because I'm potty training my kid.
Yeah.
And so they have that before they get down to business. And now the reactions of people are put into context.
Yep.
So now it's like, okay, I know you a little better, and I know you're a little raw right now because you didn't get any sleep this weekend, and so if you sort of snap at me, I'm not going to take that personally because I understand where you're coming from.
Yep.
Yeah, and I just think that's a great technique as far as your workplace and your team will allow.
And there are other cultures that start with that.
Right.
And it is part of part of business, as I've learned. So let's move on to you talked a little bit earlier about fake empathy. And you call it the empathy veneer in the book, and I think there's probably a couple sides to that. One could be the human side of empathy veneer, but also how a brand could behave from an empathy veneer point of view. So maybe we could talk about that a bit.
Yeah.
And maybe how to see through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is always the thing you get met with when you write a book like this is, oh, you're just teaching people how to like game the system, right? And that's why I had to talk in the book about leadership and culture before I even got to the brand part. Because part of my brand work is you can't just what I say, paint a coat of brand, put a coat of brand paint on your business and hope it sticks. Right. Culture and brand are two sides of the same coin. So if you're going to go to the market and say, we're really innovative, what are you doing internally with your culture, with your team? Do you invest in R&D? I work with a lot of tech clients, and they all want to be Apple, right? But you're not doing the things Apple did to be Apple. And this is the stuff that's internal. It has nothing to do with slick ads and a cool website and a funky logo. It has to do with, how are you treating your people? How are you hiring them? How are they rewarded? What are the accountability structures? Airbnb is a great example of a company that lives their values inside and out to the point that on their performance reviews, this whole idea of their sense of belonging, which is their mission, people are promoted and reviewed based on their values. And so it's not just like a list of values that somebody stuck on a wall and nobody uses in their daily decision making. So that's actually part of my brand work, but that's how you can spot that empathy veneer is sort of like, are they empathetic with their employees? Right. Are they empathetic with their supply chain? Are they empathetic with their business partners? Do they act with compassion as a company internally before you try to tell me, oh yeah, because we gave to the soup kitchen once a year, that means we're empathetic, right? So it's how to avoid that one-hit wonder type of thing.
Got it.
If it's really baked into the DNA, it's more genuine.
So we're going to have our empathy radar.
Exactly.
When we leave the room, we'll have our empathy radar.
Exactly. And I have some examples of companies that say they're empathetic but are not in the book.
We won't name them on the stage.
Yeah,
you have to read the book.
I won't shame them publicly.
So the next part of your book is about the empathetic leader, and we've touched on some of it already as we've gone through it. And I think a question I would ask there is, how do you know that you're making progress being an empathetic leader, right? Because we're not perfect, right? We're all going to have our days, our moments. Some days are better than others, you know, based on our experience that night or that morning or what's happening.
Right.
But how do you know generally, like how can you, when you're in a moment of quiet or meditating or on a plane for 6 hours, like think about, I think I'm making progress.
Right.
Do you have tools and methods for that?
Well, I don't quite go into that in the book, but I think it's a matter of constantly checking in with your team, right? So the biggest part of an empathetic culture and being an empathetic leader is creating an environment of trust. Because if people are too busy worrying somebody's going to stab them in the back, first of all, that's where you inhibit innovation and creativity. And so that's why in empathetic organizations, the data shows that they actually have more innovative ideas, they bring more innovative products to market, because people have, their mental energy is freed up to actually do their jobs, right? So if you're checking in with your people, you know, how are you feeling about things? What can I help with? What big wins did you have this week? What did you learn this week? How can I help you be successful? That whole servant leadership mindset, over and over again, the leaders that I interviewed in the book all kind of went back to this whole thing about leading with humility. And I'm here to serve my people. They're not here to serve me.
Right.
And if you think about maybe some of the least empathetic people you've worked with, they don't have that mindset. You don't feel like they have your back. So checking in with your teams of, you know, do you feel seen, heard, and understood? Do you know, what do we need to talk about? What do we need to discuss? What roadblocks do we need to remove in your path? What's going to motivate you? And what are you looking for your next step? How can I help you get there?
Got it.
I think even just flipping the way you talk is a huge first step.
So how, because there's a lot of leaders in the room that manage people, and not everybody's a high performer on every team.
Right.
So as a leader, what does an empathetic, and get really maybe micro here for a second, what does a performance review look like for maybe somebody who's not performing if it's delivered in an empathetic way?
I think it's about really the curiosity. So not you did this wrong, you did that wrong, this is where you fail. I mean, you have to share that information, right? If someone's inept or not doing their job. But again, it's why. What's going on for you? Is it that, are you bored? Do you not have the skill set? Do we need to get you some extra training? Or one of the most empathetic things that leaders talk to me about over and over again is sometimes the most empathetic thing is letting someone go. Because they're in a position where they're being set up for failure every day. They just don't have the skill set for that role. And so sometimes it requires guiding them to that conclusion of, let's see if we can find a better fit for you, or let's see if we can change your job responsibilities. But I think going at it, you know, just like parenting, where it's you did this wrong, you did that wrong, da-da-da-da-da-da, find out why. Find out what's going on for that person after you have that conversation. I think that's a much more productive performance review for someone who's having problems.
That's a really good insight, and I think great direction that people can apply.
Absolutely.
When they leave the room today.
Yeah.
The next section you have, and we have a few minutes left, is about the empathetic culture. But I'm going to focus specifically on one thing, which I think that we're in an era where there's 5 generations in the workplace.
4, sometimes 5.
4, sometimes 5, And I would imagine advertising probably can span. And you talk about how empathy can break down generational barriers. Maybe we talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a Deloitte study that shows that millennials and Gen Z are among the most empathetic and diverse generations entering the workforce. So the interesting thing about that is they have grown up in an environment where they've always been used to having a voice. And they are only going to work for companies where they know that's the environment they're going into. The great thing is, unlike my generation, they're actually linking it to business results. They're saying, we need diversity of thought and experience because it leads to more innovation, better business outcomes, all that kind of stuff. It's table stakes for them now. So the top talent, and it's a tight labor market. It's kind of no longer even a competitive advantage that you say, hey, we're empathetic. Look at our little pie chart of how diverse our organization is. How are you harnessing those different points of view? How are you using them to make better business decisions? Those are the companies they're demanding, and the companies that don't keep up with that are going to die. So the thing about the generational understanding is understanding what motivates them. It's this, it's diversity of thought. They call it cognitive diversity. It's the being able to express opinions, being able to have a say. And like I think the statistic is over 70% will work longer and harder for companies that have an empathetic culture of millennials, I think, is one of the studies that I cited. So I think instead of those like biases and prejudices of like, oh, this group is lazy, this group is out of touch, this group is, is there a way we can figure out what's motivating them at a generational level?
Right.
And what is their life like, at, what they grew up with? And also in the reverse too, a millennial understanding what things are like for a baby boomer who's sort of aging out of the workforce.
Or the olds, they call us.
The old guard,
olds.
I know, totally.
Yeah, I get called that.
Yeah, it's like
Old.
an understanding like this is a generation that didn't grow up with social media. They didn't grow up. I mean, I remember when I was looking for my first job out of college, like I just was like looking at pay and benefits, right? And now 71% of millennials demand a culture that feels like a second family.
Amazing.
I didn't even think you could ask for that in a workplace, right? And so I'm excited because this is what I try to educate. It's like we should be thankful the younger generations are changing this conversation because we were too scared to ask for it.
It's true.
Right? So if they're humanizing the workplace, we're spending the bulk of our time there. Like that's a good thing. We should be appreciating that. So I think that's where you start to get that empathetic lens from a generational point of view.
That's a great point of view.
Yeah.
And I think just to close it out, on to the point you just made on the page 187, you closed the book with, in case you missed it, this book has a larger, sneakier mission, but just to help leaders like you and brands like yours succeed by adopting an empathy mindset, but to ultimately create a more empathetic world, starting with work. Great mission.
Trying.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a really incredible book.